You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm joined by Édith Goldsztajn, a born and bred Frenchwoman and freelance journalist based in the UK. She's here to discuss the weightiness of the French girl aesthetic and what it means for young women growing up in a world where they're expected to be effortlessly thin, white, wealthy, city-dwelling, and beautiful. Française. I'm so excited to welcome Édith Goldsztajn to the podcast. Édith, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I would love if you could just give our listeners a little bit of information about who you are and what you do and where you come from.
Yeah, I'm a journalist and editor working mainly in women's magazines in the US and the UK. And I was born and raised in France, mainly in Paris, but a little bit in the countryside. And I left at 17 and I studied at UCLA in Los Angeles. So I was in English-speaking countries since I was 17. And then after 5 years there, I wasn't able to get a work visa. So I moved to London, which is where I am now.
Wow, quite a globetrotter. So you have all of these different elements of different cultures, you know, English and French and American kind of swirling around in you. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this word française today. Specifically because you put an interesting tweet out into the universe a little while ago, and it got quite a bit of attention. Could you tell me a little bit about kind of what led you to write that tweet? What was sort of going on in your mind when you wrote those, I think we're over 140 characters at this point, but when you wrote that short little missive out into the universe?
I had been thinking about kind of exploring what the French girl ideal meant to me, or like sort of awoke in me for a while. And it's not been something that's really central to my life and, you know, really like angers me all the time. But when I see it, it really grates sort of, you know, how to dress like a French girl. So I'd been thinking about it for a while and I'd pitched it to a couple places that weren't interested. So I just sort of put it on Twitter and wanted to see if anyone had any interest. And I really didn't expect to get as much interest as I did. And then I ended up writing a piece for British Vogue about it, which was awesome.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I mean, it is like this sort of pervasive idea that, you know, I grew up with in the US, this sort of French women dress better and they parent better and they cook better and they, you know, lose weight, you know, without even thinking about it. And they are effortlessly sexy and, you know, chic. And it's this mindset that I always thought of as giving foreign women who were looking at French women through this lens, this impossible ideal to live up to. And I must admit, guiltily, I had never thought what it must be like to grow up within that structure. So just, you know, right off the bat, do you have any sort of poignant or specific memories of growing up within that sort of lens and thinking, gosh, this is who I'm supposed to be?
Yeah, it's a kind of a weird one because I wasn't really aware that, you know, that the French girl thing was such a, like, an ideal, something that was painted as something you wanted to achieve, especially in England and in America. But the way I felt it growing up was, you know, just not living up to the ideal of what it was like to be a French teenager. So there's a bit of a dichotomy there because it wasn't, you know, trying to live up to what the magazines say, because obviously the French magazines aren't saying, here's how to be a perfect French girl. But I definitely felt I was, you know, short of the mark. There was like, I was just awkward and like a lot of teenagers, right? It's not unique to France, but there is a certain snobbery in France that I think isn't necessarily present in other places. Like you know, like it's so important what you wear to school and, you know, what like designers you're wearing and, you know, not designers, but like you have to have the Repetto shoes and like, even something like an Eastpak like backpack, which is so uncool now, but that was like such a, that means that you've made it. And things like, I always use this example that, I really liked pop music and I really liked Taylor Swift. And it was so embarrassing to like that in France. And there was a feeling, and I might be wrong, but there was a feeling that in America, you were allowed to like things, you're allowed to be excited by things. And in France, there's very much like nonchalance about everything, sort of like, ugh,
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've explored from the opposite perspective, like coming from America where it is like cool, in major scare quotes, to be excited about stuff. And then coming to France and feeling like anytime I got excited about something, some French person was like, ah oui, vous les Américains, c'est trop amazing, quoi. Like everything is everything has to be great and every friend is your best friend and every meal you eat is, awesome. So yeah, there is this like practiced nonchalance in France. And I can imagine that if you were growing up and you were excited about something like Taylor Swift, how you might have to keep those feelings a little more muted, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. And I just don't really get it. Like, why would you not want to be excited about things? Like, why would you want to make your life worse? It's very weird to me.
And I think there's this, when we imagine French women and French girls from the outside looking in, and we see this like, natural air of like cool, like disconnected almost, like you like a French woman can't be flustered almost. That seems to come sort of part and parcel with this thing of not being too invested in things. And maybe, maybe part of what, I'm just sort of riffing here, but maybe part of what Americans specifically, or maybe even Brits, are looking at in the French is this desire to like not care quite so much, and to be unplugged a little bit from what matters. But living in that, I mean, it diminishes probably the real feelings that you have towards things that you're excited about.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm now thinking like, am I just like dissing the French as like as a people, and I sound like I hate everyone there and everything, but I guess I'm just sort of saying from my perspective what it was like and how I experience it when I go.
Yeah, it doesn't sound to me like you're dissing anybody. I think it's just a question of what our natural proclivities are and what's happening in the society we're in. I mean, I know for myself, like I had kind of the opposite problem, which might be why I ended up in France and you ended up in the Anglo world. It's like I was growing up and I had a very charismatic younger sister who was always excited about everything and always really bright and smiling and excited. And that felt like what I was supposed to be as an American teenager. Whereas I felt quite awkward and quite bookish. And like, I didn't like talking to people and like, social situations exhausted me. And I just kind of wanted to like sit and observe people. And that always made me come off as kind of like resting bitch face. So I think I tend to do better in France, where like a lot of those like really surface level emotions are sort of downplayed a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting as well, because like in terms of like, if you have social anxiety in France, like good luck, right? Because you have to double kiss everyone and like you have to make sure you say hello and goodbye to everyone. Otherwise everyone will get offended. And I find that aspect really difficult as well. So there's both.
Totally. Do you have a recollection of the first time once you'd left France that you realized that there was this framing or this image of what French girls or French women were abroad?
I don't really have a specific example, apart from maybe like, I think there might have been a comment or two about how French women don't shave their underarms. But apart from that, what I'm thinking happened is that when I started seeing, how to dress like a French girl in Anglo magazines, I'm thinking that it made sense to me. I'm thinking it didn't shock me because I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense, because like there is a kind of sense of superiority, in terms of like how you dress and like, or like tastefulness that I guess I'd like internalized.
Yeah. And then I'm wondering too, like we have some images of French women that feel quite true, like the ones that you just cited. And then we have others that feel either untrue or outdated or like overgeneralized. Like, if you imagine a French woman and, she's effortlessly sexy, and she probably smokes, and she doesn't have to work hard to lose weight, and she parents her children super well, so her kids are the best behaved anywhere. You know, obviously not all French women live up to those stereotypes, obviously. But are there any that feel either particularly true kind of across the board or particularly false? And you're like, I don't know why foreigners think French women are like this, because they're really not.
Well, for me, and this has been pointed out to me a lot, and I think I didn't quite state it in as many words in my British Vogue piece, I've been told a lot that the French woman they're talking about is a very specific French woman. She's from Paris. She lives in central Paris. She's white. She's naturally skinny. She's wealthy. She's educated. So sort of by definition, she's not every French woman, because there's a lot of people outside of Paris. There's a lot of non-white people in France, and, you know, and there's a lot of racism. There's a lot of fat phobia that comes into play. And those are, I think, internalized in people who don't fit that mold within France. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that kind of leads into another question that I wanted to discuss with you, which is this perception of French women and this sort of idealization of one very specific type of white, thin, Parisian French woman dangerous for French women and for women elsewhere as well?
I mean, it's just quite backwards. Like, you know, we're in an era where, you know, we're supposedly, I know we're going back on like with the runways being like a lot less diverse than they were and things like that, but we're supposed to be embracing every iteration of womanhood, and clearly we're not doing it, because these articles are still popping up. These, you know, these exclusionary articles are still popping up. And in France, those sort of things, the racism, the fat phobia are still very much alive from what I see.
Do you have any sort of notion as to why society, and largely Anglo-American society, is so obsessed with the image of a French girl as opposed to like an Italian girl? Like, why are we not looking at like a Roman and saying like she's the ideal, or, you know, a Londoner and saying like she's the ideal? Like, why have we gotten so obsessed with this idea of Frenchness, and then by extension, as you've mentioned, like Parisianness as our ideal of womanhood?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know where that came from. You know, I mean, part of it is kind of the ubiquitous ideal of what a woman should be like, maybe in the early 2000s, like, you know, thin and white is, you know, what you would see on Calvin Klein ads.
Mm-hmm.
So there's part of that. And like the effortlessness of it is kind of like, because it's not really sexy to say like that you're on Atkins or whatever. But I don't know.
That's actually a really interesting thing that I hadn't quite thought about. You know, when you're talking about getting excited, there's also, I think, in France, and correct me if I'm wrong, this embarrassment around trying. So like Americans are always happy to talk about like, oh, I'm, you know, intermittent fasting, or I've started a cleanse, or I'm going to the gym, blah, blah. And I get this sense that French women almost want you to think that everything is easy for them, and they're maybe less likely to talk about the effort they're putting into things. Does that strike you as true?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously will have more experience than me with adult French women. With 17, you know, my family's still there and stuff. It's not like I don't have any experience, but I talked about that in my article. That's kind of, it's absolutely central to the stereotype anyway of like, this is just how I woke up, and you'll never be as good as me because you weren't born like this. And I mean, I'm sad to hear that it holds true in real life, but yeah.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy our sister podcast, City of Muses, which is brand new to the Paris Underground Radio Network. Each week, join City of Muses host Jennifer Garrity as she sits down with contemporary artists, poets, dancers, designers, and performers to explore what inspires them, where their ideas come from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Inspiration and creativity meet in Paris, the City of Muses. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to navigating the French.
Well, if we dial it back to when you were in France, because I think that those sort of like 15, 16, 17 years old as a teenage girl, such a formative time and such a time when you're sort of like, if you do not fit that naturally skinny, white cleared skin mold, whether you're in France or America, you're going to probably struggle with your self-image. But I think I'm curious, when you were growing up in France, did you get the sense that you were supposed to naturally know how to do your makeup without having to ask anybody else, for example, or naturally know how to dress cool? Or was there a lot of societal pressure for you to know how to do things that maybe you didn't know how to do right away and you would have wanted more guidance on?
I mean, I think even friends would definitely make you aware if you'd missed the mark.
Okay.
Be like, ugh, how come you didn't know that? Or that kind of comment. But I also I wasn't encouraged to ask questions or ask for help, generally. So yeah, it was all quite confusing.
And then socialization wise, when you were, 14, 15, 16, 17 in France and then suddenly in the US, did you notice a difference in the way that your peers, the expectations basically that your peers had for how effortless your cool was going to be in France versus the US?
I very much played down the fact that I was French.
Okay.
It would take people a while until they actually realized. So, I mean, as you probably can hear, I still have some American inflections, but I was very much playing that up when I was there. So it would take people a couple sentences to be like, wait, do you have an accent?
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a lot, and I love America so much, but the geography is not great. So I would be like, oh yeah, I'm French. And they'd be like, oh yeah, I can hear it. So I guess they didn't really have any expectations for me as a French person because I was so playing it down.
Mm-hmm.
There's just one incident that comes to mind, which is I guess it's the other way around, but I wore a blazer on campus and two people stopped me being like, are you going somewhere? Yeah, I'm going to class.
Oh, wow. And were the expectations just, I mean, if you were kind of passé inaperçu as you weren't flagrantly French, did you notice that in your not being French, that just the social expectations of you as a fellow American student, let's say, did that feel quite different from what you'd had in high school?
I think I was just so freed by, I really felt like American. I really felt like this was where I was meant to be. So I think all my energy was just spent on being a version of myself. Obviously, I wasn't being entirely myself. I was 17. You don't know who you are. But it just made so much sense to me for my personality. And it was kind of phew, I can breathe. So there wasn't as much striving to be a certain way. I guess that happened more when I was trying to join a sorority.
Well, what elements then of American culture felt so welcome to you when you finally made it to America and were like, oh my God, this is where I'm meant to be? What specifically felt so much like a homecoming for you?
I mean, it's genuinely the enthusiasm. Genuinely, I can be excited about things. I can be like, oh my God, be squealy and enjoy things. That felt like the biggest thing. And I didn't feel like I was putting it on. It was oh, I can finally do this.
So we have this French woman that we've kind of described to is obviously an ideal and doesn't really exist. And that's problematic both for foreigners looking at her and for French women growing up in this structure who are trying to live up to this perfect ideal that doesn't exist. If you had to imagine, a different kind of framing where we stopped writing a million articles about how French women parent better and dress better and have sex better than everybody else, and we started thinking, okay, what would actually be helpful for young French women to look up to? Are there any role models or ideals that you think would have been helpful to you as a young woman growing up in France, or would be more helpful to the extremely diverse contingent of French adolescents who are growing up now? Who do you think they should be looking up to?
I don't know about a specific person, but I think a lot of the discourse that's happening now is just really, really liberating and helpful. Just even like having therapy, which is basically asking someone for help, is like okay. And the like embracing of greater diversity on all levels, just the normalization of like how you are naturally is okay. I just think all of that would be so much more helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It sounds like it would be helpful across the board, like not just. I think we're maybe moving in the right direction.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like for me, like it's kind of like France is like 10 years behind. Like, why is this still happening? Like, why are we still striving to be this like insane thing that we're not, right?
Yeah. And what seems to be like kind of this underlying factor in the whole conversation, and what makes this, idealized French woman so appealing abroad, and what makes her so dangerous for French girls growing up, is this forced nonchalance and lack of effort, which I think, appears in what you glommed onto in America with this like enthusiasm. Like, it's not cool to care. And if it's not cool to care, then it's not cool to try. And that means that anyone for whom these things are not effortless is set up for failure, because either they're going to fail or they're going to have to show that they're trying.
Yeah. And just like, why, like, I don't understand why that would be. I think it's changing. But yeah, I just remember like when I was preparing to go to university, like people in France were kind of like, ugh, like it doesn't matter anyway, because I'm like not going to get a job anyway. Like there's no jobs anyway. It's like, you're 17. Like you should be embracing like every opportunity, every possibility that could happen. Like you could literally make your life be anything and you're already giving up. Like, yeah. Why is that what you're encouraged to do? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, if you could tell, 15-year-old you something about the way that the framing of your world at that point was going to change, what would you tell her?
I mean, I think just there's nothing wrong with you, right? Like, and that probably applies to like every 15-year-old in the world. But, I just wish that I was allowed to be what I was, and that I didn't face as much like judgment from kind of all directions.
I mean, I think that that's something we could all digest, and it probably definitely affects teenage girls, but I think there's something of a teenage girl in all of us these days, and we could all use a little more grace with ourselves.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this issue to the light and to agreeing to come and chat with me about it. For those who want to read a little more about what you're doing, what you're writing, where can we find you? Where are you most often writing?
I am the morning editor for Marie Claire US, so writing 4 or 5 stories there every morning. So you might have seen me on Facebook or something. But yeah, I write for InStyle, Brides, like I'm kind of all over the place, but a lot of US publications. And then my website is just my full name.
Awesome. Well, we'll put a link to your website and to your Twitter feed, and of course to the Vogue story in the show notes. So anyone who wants to read more of Iris's work is more than welcome to take a gander. And before I let you go, I just have one last question for you, which is, what is your favorite word in French?
Ooh, I know this one. It's gourmand, because there isn't a word in English that means that you like food and it's not a judgmental word. Weirdly, right? Like it should be the other way around. But yeah, I love that it's like, oh, I enjoy food and like I like to eat it, and that's not a problem.
Oh, absolutely. That is a word that I have been wanting to have someone come onto the podcast to discuss for a while now. I agree with you. That is a great word and lacks translation. So awesome. Well, thank you very much, Iris. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And listeners, thank you so much for tuning in.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.